Welcome. I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And you can see a little bit about my ministry and where I serve in my bio slide that just came up at the beginning of this video. I want to welcome you to episode 5 of our Bible study on the Psalms. In today's episode, we are examining two psalm types. One are trust psalms, and the second is acrostic poems. So as I've done in these other videos, I'm going to start using with a psalm as our prayer for opening. But before I get into that, I do encourage you to have a Bible translation of your choice. It can be digital or printed, whatever works for you. And then paper, pen and pencil to write down your thoughts, reflection, comments, questions. If you're a doodler, you need something to do with your hands, feel free to use that paper for your doodles. However that helps, but it sometimes is helpful to have a piece of paper to write down your thoughts as we continue to move forward. I encourage you to add your comments, thoughts, questions, reflections in the comment section on the YouTube channel, or you can reach out to me on my social media or email, which will show up at the end of the video. So again, welcome to the 5th episode on the study of the Psalms. Our opening psalm is Psalm 131. I'm going to read that for us now. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time on and forevermore. This is a psalm that is considered a trust psalm, which is one of the types of psalms we're discussing today. But it is a psalm that would often be used as well for those who were journeying to Jerusalem, who are coming for a pilgrimage. So as I mentioned in other videos, sometimes these psalms fit more than one category, especially when they're thematic. They touch more than one theme. So the trust psalms, I'll pop this slide up here for you so you can read along, and I'll also put this slide at the end. The trust psalms are Psalm 11, 16, 23, 27, 46, 52, 63, 121, 125, 129, and 131. And these psalms are professions of faith in God's protective presence or God's power in the midst of threatening circumstances. So in summary, these psalms assert God's sovereignty despite the appearances to the contrary by what's going on in the life of the psalmist, or for us as readers, we might be attracted to a psalm because they speak to a particular place where we are in our lives at this time. So that is just a little bit about these psalms. We are going to use Psalm 27 as our example for today. So I'm going to give you a moment to turn to Psalm 27 if you have your Bible with you. I'll read the psalm and then we'll go through and look at how the psalmist writes this psalm and lifts up the themes that make it a psalm of trust. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is a stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and foes, they shall stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. One thing I ask of the Lord, that I will seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now my head is lifted up above all my enemies around me. I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger, you who have been my help. Do not cast me off. Do not forsake me, O God of my salvation. For my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Do not give me up to the wiles of my adversaries, for the false witnesses have risen against me, and are breathing out violence. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Some of you probably remember some of those verses. Rarely do we necessarily recite the whole thing, but that idea of wait for the Lord, or the Lord is my light and my salvation, are words that are used in many other places and in many other ways. So this psalm opens with a summary of the entire message. So verses 1 through 6 really start to summarize the whole of this psalm. So the Hebrew words that are translated as light and fear are similar to the words that we see for fear in Mark chapter 5, verse 36. So God is my light. God reveals light. Referring to God as my light anticipates verses 8 and 9. Or even the references to God's face or God's face shining are all things that interplay. And of course, then the idea of fear, which is that awe, that presence of God, is also being seen in here. And so these first 6 verses really focus on the understanding of the authority and the power and the sovereignty of God, and really why this psalm is considered a psalm of trust, because it starts out right from the beginning that God is the one in whom I trust. If God is my light and my salvation, I have nothing to fear, right? There's nothing that can move against me if God is with me. But it's also done in such a way, and we'll talk about this a little later, that the psalmist doesn't say that all problems will disappear, but that God is present, that God is in the midst of the challenges, and that this person will continue to trust in God's sovereignty and God's reign and God's rule and God's protectiveness and God's mercy, even in the midst of enemies, in the midst of challenges. So this is a profession of faith and a prayer all together into one psalm. So he's affirming or she is affirming what they believe about God, but they're also praying for God to continue to bring intervention and to support in the midst of challenges. So there is some militaristic languages in verses 2 and 3, and also again then in verse 12, which indicates that the psalmist is experiencing some sort of persecution. There's some enemies standing against him, but these are not necessarily armies in the literal sense. This may not be like in my Bible it says this is a Psalm of David. It may not be a literal army, but that which is causing challenge. The enemies that come against us are not always physical enemies. They're not necessarily a military army. And if you think about it, we all have those enemies that strike us down, that cause us to struggle in our life and to struggle in faith. So this psalm can be taken in that way as well. And then in verses 4 through 6, the psalmist appears to take asylum in the temple. but yet it might be able to be read more metaphorically than literally, because the psalmist also uses the word tent, talking about going up on a mountain, but also, being wrapped in the tent of the Lord. So this may not be, again, as literal as it is. In verse 4, one thing I ask of the Lord, that I will seek after the Lord, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. And again, is this the literal temple, the one in Jerusalem, or is this those sacred places? If this was written before the building of the temple in Jerusalem, then this would have been in the tent of meeting. This would have been wherever the community was gathered to hear the word of God. And then, of course, in verse 5, he will hide me in his shelter. Again, that's not the same word as temple. But then ultimately, he will cover me in his tent, and he will set me on a high rock. So again, these are all different ways to consider how one finds protection. And this is how God works for the life of the psalmist, and hopefully as we study this psalm in our lives as well. So then in verses 7 through 12, we start to hear the petitions that are prayers. These are the petitions that the psalmist is asking particular answers for. So again, starting in verse 7, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me." Isn't that what prayer is, right? And it doesn't have to be aloud, but it's a calling out to God, sometimes in joy, sometimes in sorrow, but it is that reaching out and seeking God's presence, and which is, I think, very powerful for us as we remember what prayer is for us. And again, if the psalmist didn't believe in this sovereign God, then the psalmist would have no reason to pray, to be calling out to a God that he didn't believe would be interested or willing to hear. So this is just a wonderful reminder for us about this. So then as we continue on through this and we look at verses 8 and 9, we hear the word face, that they're looking to see God's face. Now remember, the understanding was that if you saw the face of God, you were dead. If you were living human being and you saw the face of God, you would die, because it was too overwhelming for us to comprehend, to truly see the full presence of God. And even Moses on the mountain did not see the face of God. He saw the glory of God, which in and of itself is overwhelming. So for one to seek the face of God is truly that I want to be in your presence. I want your presence unknown to me. And so this really is a key piece of that. And then verse 9 begins a series of imperatives, and this is language that is not a gentle asking. Let's go to the park is an imperative, not do you want to go to the park, or would you join me at going to the park. An imperative is sometimes stated as a question, but it's not really a question, it's a statement. Let's go to the park. So the psalmist begins these imperatives of what he's asking God to do, of God's presence, and how the psalmist wants God involved in the psalmist's life. So of course the first is be gracious to me and answer me. And your face, O Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. These are imperatives. There's no question about this. Not, will you show me your face? Like, don't hide your face from me. In the later part of verse 9, do not turn your servant away. Do not cast me off. The Lord will take me up. These are said in such a way that they're not questions. They're not pleading. There's a trust in this is how God is going to work. This is what I want for you in this reality. So then, in verse 11, the psalmist really starts to say, this is who I am. I want you to teach me. Teach me your ways. Help me. Lead me on a level path. Do not give me up to my adversaries. So this is, again, how is God to work in the others? And then 13 and 14 are exhortations. They're public proclamations for the hearer or reader of the psalm to say, this is what God has done, or this is what God is doing, and this is what I will do as my response to what God has done. So I believe I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, just like Moses, remember, seeing the face of God. And then 15, wait for the Lord, be strong. Let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. So there's this imperative, this exhortation, I shouldn't say imperative, there's this exhortation to say, don't give up. Wait for the Lord. The Lord is our strength, our courage, our wisdom, our grace, our hope, our life. I trust in the Lord. Wait for the Lord. Take courage, right? Take courage. Trust in the Lord. Wait. So this is a psalm of trust. The psalmist trusts in God. The psalmist uses these imperatives to say, I know what God can do. I know what God will do for us. And then ultimately ends in this reminder to wait for the Lord, that the Lord answers. The Lord is with us. The Lord will guide and protect us. And those are really, again, it affirms that trust. We don't wait for someone we don't trust who's going to show up. So you're going to wait for God because you know or you trust that God will be present and God will do what God says he will. So that is a trust psalm. As I'd mentioned, there's some other ones there. You'll notice that trust psalms, some of them have similarities and might have some lament in them, but they also have trust. So, that's an interesting thing. In the midst of that, one of the world's most famous psalms, Psalm 23, is a trust psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the valley of the shadow of death, I know no evil, for you are with me. Again, one of the most known trust psalms, but not the only one. And clearly, if you read through some of the other ones, you'll find them to be very powerful as well. Just not the one that has gained kind of common popularity. So I encourage you to read some more of those and see if some of those other ones don't speak to you, and maybe feel more to where you are. Not to say that Psalm 23 isn't valuable, but sometimes it's not actually the one that you really need. It's one that we might know by heart, but it's not one that really speaks to where we are. So the second type of psalm we're looking at are called acrostic poems. And these are not thematic in nature. They're actually similar based on their style. And as I'd mentioned, and we've looked at some of the other ones in other studies, acrostic poems can have very different thematic natures. But what they hold in common is that they either spell out a word or they use the letters of the alphabet to mark each verse or sets of verses. So the longest one of these is Psalm 119. So each set of verses starts with a letter. So there's more verses than there are letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So just to keep that in mind. So I'm going to pop up the slide here with the numbers of acrostic poems. And 9, 10 are marked as two psalms, but they're actually part of the same acrostic poem. So they follow right after each other in the acrostic alphabet model. So then we also have Psalm 25, Psalm 34, Psalm 37, Psalm 111, Psalm 112, Psalm 119, and Psalm 145. Today in our example, we're going to use Psalm 25. This is an acrostic poem. It does have a couple of wrinkles in it. Verses 11 and 12 are actually not following the acrostic pattern. They actually step out of that. They start with two different letters than in the order they go. But the first, the middle, and the final verses, when taken in order, spell Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So they do make sense, even though they fall out of the alphabetical acrostic nature when taken as a whole, and then including those three verses in that nature, then they actually fall into place. So Aleph is the first letter. It's also the first. It's the first letter of the alphabet. It's also the first letter of this psalm. So the psalm does follow the alphabet with the exceptions of 11 and 22, where those are brought in and spell the word Aleph, which, again, as I mentioned, is the word beginning, or the first letter of the alphabet. So there is some reason why those fall out of the straightforward acrostic pattern. For those of you who didn't hear it in the previous episodes when we talked about acrostics could be using the letters of a word that you then create your poetry from. So you've probably all done this at some point in your childhood. You know, you had Valentine, or you had Easter, or you had mother, or you had father, and you would take those letters, and then the first word of each line of that poem would start with that letter. Thankfully, you know, there's a variety. We don't have too many big holidays that have X's and Z's in it to try to figure out how to make that work. But you know, there's popular letters and there's not so popular letters. So this is what the acrostic poem is. So it's not a new style of poetry. It's had great history. It does give an anchor. And again, the acrostic poems here that are listed in the Psalms are named as such because of the style they're written in, not the thematic nature, where what we just talked about in the trust Psalms is that they have a particular thematic nature that holds them in common. So this particular Psalm, Psalm 25, let me read it for you, and then we will break it down a little bit more. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be put to shame. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Do not let those who wait for you be put to shame. Let them be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous. Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all day long. Be mindful of your mercy, O Lord, and of your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in his way. He leads the humble in what is right, and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for all who keep his covenant and decrees. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who are they that fear the Lord? He will teach them the way that they should choose. They will abide in prosperity, and their children shall possess the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes his covenant known to them. My eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and bring me out of my distress. Consider my affliction and my trouble and forgive all my sins. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. O guard my life and deliver me. Do not let me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. My integrity and uprightness preserves me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all its troubles. So as I'd mentioned, there's 22 verses in this psalm. Verse 11 is the central verse, and the way the psalm is written, it really directs the attention to verse 11. So the middle petition has a section of praise, which is verses 8 through 10. Verses 1 through 7 are an introduction. And then 12 through 15 are assurances. So 11 really is the central point of this. And so most commentators say, verse 11 is the central part of this. This is what the psalmist is really bringing. So, for your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. For them, that's the heart of this psalm. Excuse me. But yet some of the same commentators and other commentators would say that verses 10 and 11 are more likely a combined set. So verse 10 and 11, when read together, all the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his commandments and his decrees. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. So there's also this idea of calling out God's steadfastness, God's love, God's generosity, and then pointing out the need by the psalmist for their own forgiveness by this God that is generous, is steadfast. So theologically, verses 10 and 11 are the theological center, even though 11 is kind of the structural center, and the psalm really tries to pull it together. But again, 10 and 11 serve kind of as the theological place, and they focus on the character of God, and they focus on the need of humanity for God's grace and mercy. As its thematic nature, Psalm 25 is a prayer for help or deliverance from enemies. We see that in verses 2 through 3, and then in verses 19 through 21. But it's also a prayer for release from distress in verses 16 through 18, and then again in verse 22. And then we see it also, these pleas for forgiveness in verses 7 and 8, and then verses 11 in the second half of verse 18. And then finally for guidance and instructions in verses 4 and 5. So this psalm covers a lot of different places and a lot of different themes. In the midst of it, it's a prayer for help, but it's a prayer for help for deliverance, relief from distress, forgiveness, guidance, and instruction. So there's a lot to it. But again, when you have all the letters of the alphabet to get through, you can add a lot of topic to this psalm. But also we see in this psalm that the psalmist is faithful and hopeful about God's character, and is then open to God's instruction and God's leading. So the word way or ways that occurs 4 times in verses 4, 8, 9, and 12 it comes from the same Hebrew root word that translates to lead, which we then see in verses 5 and 9. So the word way and the word lead have the same root in Hebrew, and so the fact that that word is played off both in following God's way and being willing to be led. Lead me where you want to go. emphasizes that this psalm is about a way of life or a lifestyle. It is about living in a way that is honoring to God, recognizes our own brokenness, and then is humble enough to follow God's way or God's leading. So for us as Christians, we'd be like, well, yeah, that's exactly what discipleship is, right? Following Jesus is a way of life or a lifestyle that acknowledges who Christ is and who we are and who we aren't. And this psalmist is doing the same thing. I acknowledge who I am, but I also acknowledge who you are, God, and what you are is more than I can be. But I'm willing to follow. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to grow. It's a position of humility and openness to what God is revealing, and I think that's really powerful for us as people of God and as children of the book. That we in scriptures to say, yeah, we have to be humble enough to realize that we need to be teachable. We need to be willing to learn and to grow, to check our egos, and to be careful to in thinking that we have it all together. So yeah, that need for forgiveness and the humility to grow is a huge part of faith for all of us, but especially in this psalm as well. And of course, it does tell us about God's steadfast love and his faithfulness. And of course, it does say that it's reserved for those who obey him, those who obey God, as it says in verse 11. This is the God we have. It's a God who wants to be in relationship with us and will be faithful to us as we continue to be faithful to God. Which means that when we think we've got it all figured out and we don't need God, then God's going to let us do it on our own. So again, it goes back to that humility. We need to be willing to be humble and seek forgiveness when we do get ahead of ourselves, when we think that we're better than God or we can do it better than God. So that's a really important thing to think about. So verse 12 returns to this theme of instruction, which again weaves in and out through this entire thing. God instructs, we're willing to be instructed. All of that comes together. The psalmist, remember in verses 4-5, has already asked God to teach them. And then again in verses 8 and 9, says that God is the one who teaches and guides. So there's this underlying piece as well, that this is not just about a way, but being a student, knowing that we have the teacher who teaches, that we are willing to be instructed, that we are willing to grow and be part of that. So in verses 8 and 12, the word instruct, let me make sure it's the same in my translation because it might be a little bit different. Yeah, the word instruct actually is the same root as Torah, which is instruction. In the Hebrew world, Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. They are the instruction. These are the fundamental things that we need to know. So the fact that we are extorted, that doesn't sound right. That the psalmist has this exhortation, that's the word I'm looking for us to be willing to accept a God who teaches, to live with a God who teaches, and then to follow in that way is part of this important psalm. So then we come to verses 13 through 15, which again follows up with that plead for confession and the desire for God to be with us as we are willing to follow God and do what God calls. So verses 13 through 15 describes what a life that follows God looks like. So I'm going to read those again because I think those are really interesting to read. So verses 13 through 15. They will abide in prosperity, and their children shall possess the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him. He makes his covenant known to them. My eyes are ever towards the Lord. He will pluck my feet out of the net. So this is important to understand, because prosperity, the word we translate as prosperity, is not a material wealth. And if you read the Old Testament, the people are told that they will prosper, which is more of the idea of having what they need, that they will have what life requires. So prosperity is not having the most. Prosperity also includes, having children, having longevity of your family line. Those are all things of prosperity, according to the Hebrew understanding of this word. So, we often will want to hear that as material goods, but it's really not. It's actually similar to the Hebrew word that is translated as good in verse 8, or goodness in verse 7. All come from the same root word. So one way to talk about it is those open to God's instruction will share in the goodness that characterizes God. So you will have prosperity. You will be not God-like, but God-loving. You will demonstrate God into the world, in the same way of compassion and blessing. And when Abraham was blessed by God, he said, "You will be blessed to be a blessing. You will have your multitude. Your descendants will be a multitude, not for your glory, but to be a blessing to the world." It's that same concept. We have prosperity so that we are witnesses, and not because of our wealth. We are not witnesses of God's love because we're wealthy. So I just want to make sure we say that really clearly. That is not the heart of what's going on here. So the verse 14 reinforces the idea of being connected to God, and the goodness of God, or the prosperity of God, comes back to the connection to covenant. It is relational. Our life with God is relational. God is the initiator, but we then respond, and this is what the psalmist refers to in verse 14. So the friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him. He will make his covenant known to them. God is the actor in this verse. We are responding to what God has done and what God will continue to do. So then there's two more petitions. There are verses 16 through 18, and then verses 19 through 21. Verse 16 can be seen as kind of a standard petition. It's seen in Psalm 86, verse 16, and Psalm 119, verse 132. But it appeals to God's character. So let's read that here. So verses 16 through 18. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and bring me out of my distress. Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. So again, this is that relational piece. This is a standard appeal that we would see in verse 16. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. So again, a common part that you might see in lament, or a similar wording. And then as we go into verses 19 through 21, they have this repetitious nature with the opening verses, and the first petition that mentions foes. So verses 2 and 3, and then verses 3 and 5. So let's read those. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. This is verses 19 through 21, sorry. O guard my life and deliver me. Do not let me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. So then, if we look back at verses 2 and 3, we hear this. Oh my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be put to shame. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Do not put those who wait for you to be put in shame. Let them be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous. So again, this trusting, this waiting, this repetition of the opening, and then as we draw to the closing. But all of these 4 verses all really talk about our dependence on God, and the need for God. So as mentioned before, verse 22 stands outside the acrostic structure. Some believe that it was added to make that aleph, but the fact is it really helps to kind of create this closing, redeem Israel, God, out of its troubles. So this could also help this psalm, instead of just being a personal plea, to be a communal plea. So it doesn't need to necessarily be on there, but it does, again, help with creating that aleph pattern in the acrostic. It also allows this psalm to speak for the whole identity of Israel as well as an individual person, because the relationship of God with the community of Israel is those same characteristics. Guide us, O God, let us be willing to learn. Please be willing to teach us, guide us, be with us, protect us, redeem us. When we fall and we fail, forgive us. These are continuing reminders of the life of the Israelites as well as they've journeyed through time. So those are the 2 psalm types that we're discussing today. I do encourage you to look at all those psalms that I listed before and go through there and share which is your favorite and why. And it's okay if it's Psalm 23. I really am not trying to say that's a horrible psalm. I think it's a powerful psalm. But sometimes we don't know these other ones well enough to be like, oh, wow, that one speaks to a place where I'm at. But which one is your favorite, and why? If it's too personal to share why you feel it's your favorite, you can always just leave the comment of which one was your favorite. And if you want to talk to me about why it's your favorite and want to go a little deeper, I'm more than happy to do that with you. So I encourage you to be part of the dialogue on the YouTube channel. But again, you are welcome to contact me more personally and privately through my social media or my email. Those will be coming up shortly following the psalm numbers we referenced today. So our next psalm is our next episode is episode 6. And we'll be looking at examples of psalms that are designated festival, poems, and historic psalms. So that will actually also bring a conclusion to our psalm study with episode 6. Peace and blessings be with you, and thank you for joining me.